You're listening to a CNA podcast.
In terms of research, we know a lot about the sources of conflict, but we know very little about how to actually address them effectively.
What does a healthy style of conflict look like?
You mentioned earlier that using liquid courage or just addressing the conflict openly is not something that is effective. Like why? Why is it not effective?
Yeah, it's a great question.
Hi, this is Tiffany and Gerald on the Work It podcast. We hope you've been enjoying our discussions so far and find the advice here helpful. If there are topics we haven't touched on and you feel it'll benefit your work life, do write into us at cnapodcasts@mediacorp.com.sg and let us know.
So speaking of writing in, the loyal listeners will know that we always get many emails suggesting work-related questions for our Ask Me Anything segment. So thank you for being patient with us as we slowly work our way through all these emails, all right? So Tiffany, what question have we selected for this week?
So today's question was sent in by our listener A. Recently, she's changed management and feels a bit sidelined. So she wants tips on how she can get her new bosses to know her better.
Okay. The first few days of working with your boss, yeah? That's a great one. So stay tuned all the way to the end. You'll get my thoughts about this topic. But first, back to our main discussion today, Tiffany. Have you ever had a bad run-in with a boss or a colleague? And I know this is a definite yes, right?
Yes,
for sure.
Definite yes. It's impossible actually not to have conflict in the workplace. One fond memory I have, and fond because we resolved it in the end, was that I actually had quite a bad run-in with a colleague who became a friend. We finished our work and then we went for drinks, and then I had the liquid courage to confront him about
Liquid
it.
courage, okay.
Yeah, I think it was partly the alcohol, but we ended off getting things off our chest and then laughing about it. But right at the beginning, when the conflict happened, it's hard not to take things personally. But then I've also had to eventually learn to leave the work conflict at work. So to separate the issue from the person. Yeah. What about you?
I think for me, liquid courage doesn't quite work because I don't know how it would pan out, so I tend to avoid that. I tend to process it more internally, take back the conflict and introspect a bit more before I decide my next course of action.
Okay.
So that's a little bit more for me. But like as we mentioned, it's really not possible to avoid conflicts at work, but surely there must be some healthy forms of conflict, and how can we also approach situations of conflict maturely?
Yeah.
So with us today to talk about this is Professor Sam Garg. He's the Professor of Management, Strategy and Entrepreneurship at ESSEC Business School, Asia Pacific. So welcome, Prof.
Thank you, Gerald, and thank you, Tiffany. Very excited to be here.
So, Professor, conflict management in the workplace must be something you are very passionate about, because I look through your LinkedIn profile and I see that you have been teaching this particular subject for many years. In your experience, what's the hardest conflict relationship to resolve?
In terms of research, we know a lot about the sources of conflict, but we know very little about how to actually address them effectively. And conflict in the workplace is interesting because we're talking about you and the boss, you and the peers. So there can be very simply healthy conflict is where you can tap the diversity in the organization, right? You have diversity at the structure level, so you have hierarchy. So there is a boss, there are subordinates, but also within your department or across departments, you have peers, right? So there is conflict over there. Now, as for management, this is particularly important to keep it to healthy level, not to unhealthy level, because unhealthy level means it's a leaking bucket.
Okay.
So unhealthy conflict would look like people are not talking to each other. There is a sort of covert non-cooperation. They will say yes to your face, but don't necessarily
The
follow
passive-aggressive
up.
kind.
Passive-aggressive kind. There can be dyadic conflict, it's one-on-one. It can be group conflict.
Okay.
So there are a variety of conflicts, and many times they sort of come together. Your department people are going to observe the dynamic, and they also have their horses in play.
So would you say then the hardest conflict relationship to have is the one that, say, I would have with my boss because there is some form of power dynamics involved?
Power is everywhere. We think of it as a negative thing, but without power and authority, things don't get done in organizations, right? You always have hierarchy, so there is power. If you across departments, the departments have to collaborate, there is a power dynamic there. So think about sales and technology. So who should we listen to for a project? Should the technology guys have an upper hand or the salespeople? So is it really the hierarchical one that's the most difficult? It could be because that tends to be mostly related only about power. In the horizontal one, it could be zones of expertise. So salespeople have a different perspective than this. So even if they're not looking for power conflict, sort of duke out who is more powerful, the vertical one tends to be. And at the same time, if you're subordinate, you can't really show to be a power-hungry person. That's an invitation to be fired.
Right. It will look like you are trying to challenge your boss.
That is correct, yes.
Okay. So what does a healthy style of conflict look like?
Healthy style of conflict would be you disagreeing over something. You have different ideas. See, different ideas doesn't mean it necessarily needs to conflict. And I think normally when people refer to conflict, it is actually implicitly referring to relationship conflict, being uncomfortable, being unable to adopt other people's perspective. So healthy conflict would mean that you are able to take other people's perspective, right? So you should have your ideas, but you should also be able to take other people's perspective and accept it. Now, this becomes quite difficult. For example, if you are the boss and you may have subordinates, because we know from a lot of research that more powerful people are less willing to learn. They think they are right, and so they tend to use others as tools. And as you can imagine quickly, this doesn't work in knowledge-based companies, where you tend to hire smart subordinates who may actually be much closer to the latest technologies, latest ideas. And that's why you see, for example, employee activism.
I'm just wondering, like, even from the people that I work with, individuals who work with employers and their bosses that are like that, they feel the sense of conflict. They feel like they're not being heard. They feel like they're brought in to do something, but their management is not listening to them. And like you rightly pointed out, in the knowledge business, it's a waste. So in such situations, what can an individual do to maybe align that sense of conflict a bit more?
First of all, one has to also know that managing conflict is not the only way. There is not always a solution to conflicts. So sometimes it might be more useful to exit.
I see, okay.
Right? But that's an extreme path. And it's actually sometimes important to take for mental health reasons. We did a major study, and there we studied the top fintech ventures in Hong Kong. And what we look at is hiring of new senior executives. So if you raise a lot of money, you're required by investors or strongly advised to bring in gray hair. You have fintech founders who are relatively young. So there's a twisted hierarchy. You bring in somebody who is very experienced, let's say in the 50s, and many of the fintech founders tend to be young technologists, but they own more of the company. They've been around since day one. Prior literature says two things, which is one, look, you guys are fighting too much. Let's go out for a drink, get some liquid courage, and solve it out or go over lunch. The other way is the boss is going to say, look, that's enough. We're going to go this way. What we find is neither of this is really used. And when they're used, they're completely ineffective. It is best to have a structural crafting solution, what we call structural crafting, which means you assign this person to a new role, not necessarily for the role this person was hired for, and try it out for this new role. Because if this conflict is going to continue, this is not going to be necessarily relevant. So people don't think of this as a possible solution, because ultimately you have to find person-job fit. Having said that, the solutions for peer conflicts are different. So structural crafting works far better than going out having a talk or the CEO deciding unilaterally, this is the way we do. This at least doesn't work for knowledge economy.
So when you say about this structure crafting, right? If I hear you correctly, it's about giving a set of responsibilities to this other person, the employee, for example, to be able to do what they need to do in that space.
Yeah.
And that would help them to coexist together.
That's exactly correct.
Okay.
And you might think that this person is really talented. That's why we invited them to join the company anyway, right? Now you can say, oh, maybe this person doesn't have the talent. But the other possibility is we're not matching to the right job description here. So you can try an experiment in the new role. And if that also doesn't work, you might think about calling it quits.
Yeah.
And if you immediately fire the person, for example, that's a problem too, because then it's a signal to the rest of the world that you cannot attract and retain talent. So conflict management becomes actually particularly important. And this is the way we find more effective leaders do it.
Yeah. Prof, I just want to ask a follow-up question, right? You mentioned earlier that using liquid courage or just addressing the conflict openly is not something that is effective.
Yeah.
Like why? Why is it not effective?
Yeah, it's a great question. So imagine you've hired a new senior vice president, and then that person reports to the CEO. Before that, the now underlings were reporting directly to the CEO. As you insert this person, what will happen? This underlings will now report to this new person, and the new person reports to the CEO. So the original underlings, they still continue to have direct line to the CEO. So if the CEO says, okay, Gerald, the new senior VP, and Sam, the original worker, let's go out together and sort it out. How do you think Gerald, the new SVP, is going to feel? That this underlying Sam is actually talking bad stuff behind my back to the CEO.
Okay.
And why does he have a seat on the table? He reports to me. So why should we have discussion as equals in front of the CEO? So it feels like status slighting, right? So sort of an insult. Having said that, in horizontal conflict, a variation of this works, which is, so two people from different departments, so Tiffany and Gerald, they are a bit in conflict. Not a bit in conflict, actually what we call stalemates. So two reasonable people can resolve troubles, but stalemates, you stop talking to each other. If I'm the CEO, what would I do? I could take out for liquid courage. Or what we find is the effective way is I go and talk to Gerald separately. I go and talk to Tiffany separately. I hear out the concerns of each separately. And I also tell them that, look, other people also have ideas and points. You should go and talk. So this is what we call private mediation. So I talk to you separately, and then I send you out to resolve it. So what am I doing here? I'm recreating the bridge that was so broken that you were not willing to walk forward. And this we find actually works beautifully. But it doesn't work in the vertical setting. It works very well in the horizontal setting.
It's interesting that you brought up this example because I can see that happening, like you say, between two people of a similar status. What if we're talking about conflict amongst senior executives? What if it's two C-suite leaders duking it out? So who becomes the mediator?
Again, there could be a little bit of hierarchy. CEO and the report to the CEO, they're fighting. So both are in the C-suite, but they're not two CEOs. If you have, let's say, stalemate with the CEO, then what works is the structural crafting. So you basically take out the other person, give them a temporary role, and see if you can make it work. They can add value there. Who else could be a mediator? If it's CEO and SVP of marketing, for example, it could be a board member. It could be a third party that you hire. But basically, some third party to bring these two people together.
This reminds me of a couple of stories I heard from people before. Exactly that point where equal business owners are in conflict. And then they read a stalemate and they needed that private mediation. They turned to a board member exactly to help them to untangle a little bit, to see the different perspectives. And then eventually they went separate ways, but it was done amicably, right? Because of the private mediation. They couldn't talk to each other directly. So somebody needed to step in.
By the way, if you bring the two parties together at the same table, in the horizontal conflicts, it doesn't work because both parties are trying to convince the CEO here that I'm right. So it actually polarizes like even more.
Everybody just wants more airtime with the CEO, right?
So you have to divide and conquer first.
It's a divide and conquer in some sense. But you see, ultimately, these two people are going them together and solving it.
Yeah.
It's a little bit difficult. So you ask other ways to deal with it. So other ways are also about creating certain structures to make it work. In a study of CEO and boards of directors in Silicon Valley, what I was looking at was how does the CEO manage the relationship with the board and try to make good strategic decisions.
Yeah, because if the CEO has an issue with the board or the board has an issue with the CEO, before we get to the stage where the board says you're fired, I'm sure that there are steps before that, right? How do you resolve that?
Now, if you think about it, it's a very different kind of conflict in some sense because it's not two people conflict. So you have the CEO and you have 5, 6, 7 member board, even in high growth startups. And while it may not be conflict, a stalemate kind of situation, but look, board members, because many of them are investors, would actually want you to do certain things in a certain order. And the CEO, as the founder, may have different ideas. Okay? Also, the different board members may have a dynamic with each other. The CEO might be just simply caught in the crossfire. So how do you deal with this? What we find is the CEO almost cultivates unique roles for each person, and before making these key decisions goes to these people and seeks advice on those things. So for Tiffany, I might go and talk about sales and marketing. For Gerald, I might go and talk about partnerships or technology or whatever it is. I create certain roles for you. I talk largely about those things. So you may have advice. And then I, as a CEO, retain the right, how do I stitch these things together?
Right.
Okay. And then in the board meeting, I give you only one solution. And I say, look, we have discussed already with each of you and our management team. So here is a solution. Give me advice. Okay. And they might not like it. They give you very radical suggestions, or they might give you ideas to tinker with to improve the same idea. So it requires actually pretty significant skills to actually navigate. It's sort of an inverted pyramid if you see. Yes. Most pyramids, when you think about organizations, you're thinking of it as CEO at the top, and then you have a bunch of underlings. Here, you have the opposite situation. So you have CEO at the bottom, so to speak, and then you have a bunch of bosses. So it's managing upwards.
Yes.
And managing upwards is a very difficult thing. The only thing that we know of is ingratiation, or colloquially we call it suck it up. But it is counterproductive.
Yeah.
It doesn't help the subordinate, right? And it doesn't help the company. So while that might be a solution for survival, it is not an effective way to do it for the company.
I like how you start out by saying conflicts is about power, right? And then hearing what you've talked about, the different ways of managing the conflict, it really sounds like expectations, really setting about the right boundaries, the scope, expectations, also managing those expectations as well, right? Like divide and conquer, really trying to find mediation, private mediation. And there's so much there that you've given us beyond just open communication or liquid courage, right?
Yeah.
So thank you, Prof. Sam, for all the nifty tips, I would say. I mean, it's given me some food for thought as well, even for my own life.
Yeah.
The situations I'm facing, I think this will be really helpful for our listeners. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Hello and welcome back to our Ask Me Anything segment. Our listener A sent us this question not too long ago, and I'll read it out. She says, I have been performing well under the old management. With the new management taking over, I seem to be sidelined and not been given the opportunity to shine or attend professional development courses. What is the easiest way for my new bosses to know me without me sounding too eager or seen as sucking up to them? Now, Gerald, I know that this is something that some of my friends who are a bit more reserved, they would feel this way as well. It's hard for them to yell out, look at me, look at me. In A's case, it feels like she has to start from scratch for them to get to know her. So what would be your advice?
I think for A, she needs to remember her track record.
Okay.
She's been doing well consistently under the old management. So its competency and the quality of work doesn't just disappear overnight. So I think giving herself some time to get to know the new leader, let the new leader get to know her, this is important.
Okay.
I think putting undue pressure to perform well, or to even start to ruminate and think about like, do people like me? Am I still being recognized? I think these are the things that A shouldn't do at the very early onset.
Also, another thing that A should also remember is that the new leaders or the new bosses want to get to know her as well. So they're also trying to find time to maybe get to know her, whether it's through a formal setting or an informal setting.
Yeah, I think we have to remember that when a new leader comes in, they have a whole long list of things to do. Right? They have to know so many different people. They have to get acquainted with the work very quickly. They have to make a lot of work decisions. So really giving them some time to settle in, and then A, just continuing to be consistent with the work, meeting all the work deliverables. Then at some point, there would be the opportunity to have that conversation for A to get to know the leader to get to know A as well. I think that is what A should be focusing on really right now. I know there's mention about like being looked over for opportunities for development, But you know what? There could be many other reasons why those opportunities are not happening. For example, the leader might prioritize certain things for the company, and that's the reason why maybe everybody doesn't get to go. So I'm not too sure whether is it really just something that's happening to A herself or himself, but is it really something that everybody's experiencing?
Yeah, but I guess also because in a team, when everybody has a new leader, everybody wants some airtime with the boss.
Yeah, there are some leaders, when they first come into the role, they like that attention. Yeah, there are some what I call power-hungry leaders. They come in and then they want to know who are the people who are loyal to them.
Okay.
So they will start to look out as who is trying to be their supporters, and then they will start to form that little group right from the start.
And then they will call these their core team, but actually it's just a core team of bootlickers.
It's loyalists, I call them.
Okay,
Loyalists.
you are nice.
Yeah,
so
so
you obviously you use a better word.
Yeah, so I think A can evaluate the leader, like, is this the kind of leader that she's dealing with, that she has? If that's the kind of leader that's like a bit of the power-hungry kind, looking for people to clamor for attention, then maybe A has to really think, is this how she would want to...
Is this the game she wants to play?
Yeah, how she want to handle this? I think there's a part of this that you cannot fake it. You have to be comfortable with yourself as well. But if, of course, the leader, if it's not like that, then just be patient and wait for your time. And there will be the opportunity for A to be noticed through her work, through the quality of the work, through the discussions that they have. Eventually, it will happen.
Yeah, I mean, I guess A doesn't also want to be seen as too laid back. She wants to be a bit more in control, more proactive. So one of the things that she was saying is also being put for development courses. So if she wants to do more of that, but then everybody is clamoring for attention, what can she do?
Just having that conversation, maybe block your boss's time.
Okay.
Just to have that quick conversation about development opportunities, right? Just to have that airtime to explain to your new boss, like, why are these opportunities important? What's the purpose of them? Make it clear, make it upfront, and then see what happens from there. I think right now, before that conversation has happened, it's too premature to be reading anything to it. So if today A wants to really progress in the career and not let this new management kind of set her back, then taking charge of the situation a bit more by having a conversation, being consistent with her work, waiting for the right opportunities, it will be okay. So maybe give it 3 months, 6 months, and then you see how it goes.
Another scenario I guess A could probably be in as well is that she might be feeling with the old boss there is a certain working style. Maybe the old bosses understand and give her some space to do her work so she doesn't always have to over-report. But she's fearful, I guess, what if the new bosses do things in a different way and then now she has to change her own working style? So how can A better navigate that?
Based on what A's explanation of herself has been, right? She's been giving good work quality. And I don't think this is the first time. I mean, I'm not sure, but this might not be the first time A has a new boss, right? So I think it's important at moments like this for A to kind of take a step back, right? And to reconsider, like, leadership changes is always going to be there. The people that we like to work with us, they will one day not be there as well. They will always have to grapple with change. So how do we adapt? How do we respond to those changes? Do we give ourselves time? Do we give the other person enough time? Can we also look back at our past experiences? When have we been successful in managing our situations of change?
True.
Right? Like maybe with this previous boss that she left, maybe there was also a period of time that she had to adjust to this.
Correct.
Yeah, she had to learn. So everyone is different. So giving each other the space to understand each other, and for A to just remember that you're not a bad worker just because the new boss comes in. I think whether it's about just waiting for the right time or you go and knock on the boss's door, figure out like what worked for you in the past. Right? And now with this new leader, would that same approach, would it still work for this new leader, or do you have to adapt and change a little bit as well? I would also say, look at the people around you, how they're responding, and then think to yourself, do you also want to be responding in the same way? And you don't have to if it doesn't feel right for you.
Yeah. Well, A, I hope that our conversation has assured you. Remember that you have a good track record, that you are a good worker, and more importantly, also remember that your new bosses are not adversarial. They're here to help you. And if, like A, you have a work-related question, send it to us at cnapodcasts@mediacorp.com.sg. You can also find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube, where a video version of this is at. The team behind the Work It podcast is Crispina Robert, Joanne Chan, Janani Johari, Saye Win, and Arjun Bala. Sound mixing is by Carrie Lim, video by Hanira Amin.
I'm Gerald.
And I'm Tiffany. Have a super work week ahead.